All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Urban Water Innovation Systems Research webinar series. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to continue our Thrust A seminar series with a presentation from Michigan State University's Dr. Elizabeth Mack. Our first series, Thrust A, is focused on enhancing our fundamental understanding and characterization of the sustainability of urban water systems by comparing trends in the past with alternative future land and water use, population, and climate scenarios. The seminars included in this series are organized by three themes. Theme A1 characterizes water supply demand patterns under future socioeconomic scenarios. Land and water use, land cover, and socioeconomic scenarios are used to assess two-way interactions and feedback between urban form and land atmospheric processes. Theme A2 assesses the impacts of urban water systems on urban heat islands and the regional climate and the ensuing co-benefits for human health. And finally, Theme A3 examines effects of changes in climate, populations, demographics, and policy on hydrologic and ecological processes over the observed past and future assessment periods. Our weekly webinars will meet most Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Mountain Time. Please note there is no webinar scheduled for next week, May 4th. The schedule is also available on the UN website under the Education tab. A couple quick housekeeping items. All participants have entered muted, so please use the question or chat queue to ask any questions as they arise. I'll be tracking your questions throughout the session, and we will answer all of the questions at the end of Liz's presentation. Each webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. A link to the video will be distributed as soon as it's available. Finally, a follow-up survey will be sent after the last Thrust A webinar on June 15th. Please take a moment to answer the 5 short questions and provide some meaningful feedback so we can continue to improve and create engaging and meaningful webinars. Okay, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Mack, Assistant Professor in the Department of Geography, the Environment, and Spatial Sciences at Michigan State University, where she teaches courses in economic geography. She is also a research affiliate of the Geodata Center for Geospatial Analysis and Computation. Dr. Mack's research program evaluates the impact of information and communications technologies on the development trajectory of regional economies. Her research interests are centered around economic development with an emphasis on urban infrastructure. Dr. Mack's work is also focused on understanding entrepreneurial ecosystems and water affordability. And with that, I'm going to turn the controls over to Liz. Bear with us for just one moment while we transition.
So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that we're doing to date on this segment of Thrust A, which is A1-2, and we're looking very generally at water prices and trends in water prices and what that means for households. So that's the thinking locally piece that I had in my mind as I developed the series of slides for the webinar. And then what happens to households also has larger regional impacts, and so that's the thinking regionally piece. And that's something that we're doing more work on starting now and moving into the summer. And that will be the topic, the more regionally focused piece and the strategies that we're using to estimate regional economic impacts of household changes in consumption of water and other budget items, but that'll be the topic of another webinar moving forward. All right, so my screen is not, very good. So I just want to give an overview. We're trying to answer just a couple general questions, and the first couple pieces are a little bit of background information that will help understand the study that I'm going to talk about. And the study that I'm going to emphasize came out in +1 in January of this year, and so if you're interested in looking obtaining a little bit more information about that, you can find that on just by Googling +1 and water affordability, and our recent study should pop right up. But just to provide people a background that maybe are not really centered in this socioeconomic context of water, I want to talk a little bit about some trends in water rates. It'll be U.S. focused, and then later in the presentation I'll talk a little bit about capital expenditures on water infrastructure internationally. We'll talk a little bit about variations in household water use, how water is priced, some different reasons why water prices are rising, what infrastructure needs are now and in the future, how privatization plays into a potential solution to rising infrastructure needs, and also what that might mean for water prices. Then we'll talk about the study, the +1 study that I talked about, which really sort of is a vulnerability assessment of what current and rising water rates might mean for households and the affordability of water for households. And then I'll wrap up with some forward-looking thoughts on regional impacts, which discusses, how households make spending choices as rates stay the same or go up, or from a variety of scenarios, what that might mean for regional economies in terms of cascading impacts on businesses and just the linkages between household businesses and what this means for regional economic health. So that's just a really brief overview of the content of the webinar, and I'll move on now to talk about changes in water rates. So the information, Circle of Blue did a study that looked at water rates for the largest U.S. cities, and in that study, they said that since 2010, water rates have gone up about 41% in the 20 largest U.S. cities. And they have a really nice graphic if you, the citation for this piece is in the +1 study that I talked about. So they have a really nice graphic that shows you the different water bills for these largest cities across the United States. When you think about an average, so the 41% is for the 20 largest U.S. cities, but if you think about what the average increase is nationwide, that's about 6% since 2010. And then just to look a little bit more higher resolution at this, Circle of Blue came up with some estimates of water rate increases since 2014, and so Austin, for example, has had about a 31% increase in their water rates, 15% increase in Chicago, and a 15% increase in San Francisco. So right there you can see that depending on where you are, trends in water rates vary a lot, and we'll talk about this as one of the complexities of thinking about the socioeconomics of water. And this is further complicated by variability in water use. And I believe the first webinar from the Thrust A series talked a little bit about water supply and probably touched a little bit on variability in water use. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important to understanding the vulnerability assessment that will follow towards the middle part of this presentation. So what people would define as average water use varies quite a bit. So the USGS defines average water use as about 80 to 100 gallons per person per day. Some evidence from the EPA uses that upper bound of the USGS of about 100 gallons per person per day. And then we just provide some other studies. So even within the United States, a 1996 study by Peter Gleich, a very famous person in the water sphere, has estimated anywhere between 42 gallons and 140 gallons per person per day in California alone. One study has come up with a figure of 168 gallons per person per day in Idaho. And then also this varies quite a bit internationally. So in Uruguay, people use very little water, about 16 gallons per person per day. And then Canada is sort of on the list of a high water use country. The Chenoweth 2008 study estimates that they use about 203 gallons per person a day. So aside from complexities and trends in water rates, we also have this complexity in terms of what constitutes typical water use. And the best answer to that, what is typical, no one's arrived at an answer. I've been talking with Jan Beecher at our Institute for Public Utilities here at Michigan State University, and she likes the number of 25 gallons per person per day as sort of a minimal level of use. But certainly above that minimal level of use, there's quite a bit of variability. So how is water priced? So for public, I should put a star here, water rates are designed to recover costs that a utility pays to provide service to their customers. And so the idea is that they price water exactly to recover these costs. I'll talk a little about the idea of total cost recovery in just a little bit, and the fact that water is not really priced for total cost recovery and some reasons for that. But in the public context, we can think that the total cost of providing service to people is, water prices are based on recovering that cost alone. This is different from private providers that can get some additional rate of return or make some sort of profit. And because of this difference in the ability to make profit or the sole purpose of recovering costs. The rates of private providers and public providers can and do vary. In terms of how rates are structured, there's a flat rate, and that means that a customer pays a flat charge every billing period, irrespective of how much water they use. So, you know, a customer might pay $30 every billing period. And billing periods do vary from utility to utility. So some people bill monthly, some people bill, you know, once every 2 months, some people bill quarterly. And so I would just encourage people as they maybe look at information about water bills just to check that frequency for which bills are received. Aside from flat rates, customers can also pay a uniform rate, and this is one rate for every unit of water used. So you might pay, you know, people like 1 cent per unit. So for every gallon of water you use, you pay 1 cent. Another common is CCS, cubic feet, which we often translate into gallons, just because we're more familiar with, you know, the gallon metric in terms of cubic type figures for water use. 2 other options for how water rates could be structured: a decreasing block, so the more you use, the less you pay per unit. An increasing block structure, and this is fairly typical. A customer will pay more, you know, the more water you use, the more per unit that you pay. So the block structure will typically say between, I'm just throwing some examples out here, between 0 and 5,000 gallons, you pay 1 cent per unit of water. If you use 5,001 to 10,000 gallons, you pay 2 cents. And then as you use more and more water, that per unit cost goes up. So if that per unit cost goes down, then that's a flag that you have a decreasing block structure. That's just a very, very, very simplified primer on water pricing. So a lot of studies, and I talked a little bit about rising water rates. Why are water rates going up? There are 4 reasons behind this that studies typically cite. The first is climate change, and it's a really good study, and they have some really good case study information about water affordability challenges and what's being done to help consumers grapple with potential affordability challenges by Jones and Moulton. And in their study, they said that it's about $36 billion is needed to help adapt systems to climate change. And one of the key pieces here is stormwater infrastructure and building out stormwater infrastructure. So as climate changes, the frequency of storms and the intensity of storms is likely to increase. And because of this increasing frequency and intensity of storm events, the infrastructure is needed to manage the storm waters associated with those events. A commonly cited reason for rising water prices is the increasing cost of sanitation and water quality standards. And so the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act are 2 pieces of legislation that set standards for water quality. One of the growing issues with water quality are these medications that people dump into the water system that are really hard to sort of filter out. And so the cost of providing safe drinking water for people is going up. One of the things that people have talked a lot about Flint and the water quality issues with Flint is the issue of slow growing or declining populations, and this is a situation in Detroit as well. And what's happening there is we talked that water is priced for cost recovery if we're talking about public utilities or public water utilities, and so the cost per person, very simply put, is less the more customers you have that are using a utility service. So you have your total cost of providing a service divided by the number of people that pay for that service. And again, this is an oversimplification for illustrative purposes. But if that denominator decreases, the number of people that pay for that service goes down, then the cost per person that remain customers of that particular water utility will go up. And so that's why you see some serious affordability issues in Detroit. One of the pieces here is the declining population over time. The other big piece, and that's this is the most common one across across, city contexts, is the need to replace aging and degraded infrastructure. And so it's estimated that over the next 25 years, about $1 trillion is needed to upgrade old water and wastewater infrastructure. A lot of studies have talked about the age of water and wastewater infrastructure in the United States, which dates back to just after World War II. And depending on how these costs are allocated, as I said before, the studies that talk about the extent to which water rates are increased vary. So this AWA study talks about a tripling of water rates to deal with this tremendous cost of upgrading infrastructure. Why is this so important to do? If we don't replace or upgrade this infrastructure, then we have pipe breakages, water and sewer leakages, and obviously this leads to service delays, lost water resources, and it's just not a good thing for consumers. So I talked a little bit about some infrastructure costs, or projected infrastructure costs in a U.S. context, and here's what that looks like from Global Water Intelligence. They have some figures in terms of the percent of capital expenditure growth for different regions around the world. So China looks like it's about 7%, India about 10%, and then Southeast Asia is projected to have the highest capital expenditures on water infrastructure up until 2019. So I just thought I would add that piece in there so this particular webinar isn't too U.S.-centric. So one of the solutions to this is, so we say, well, we know that water rates are going up, we know the costs, and the reason for these rising rates is that the cost of providing service to consumers is going up, so what are we to do? One of the solutions that's been offered is to privatize water systems, and the rationale for this is that private entities have different mechanisms of raising water through perhaps stock initial public offerings of stock or a greater variety of bond instruments, and so they might be able to finance these rising infrastructure costs more easily than a public entity who has fewer options. Private entities, as I mentioned before, in terms of water pricing, also have this option of building in some sort of profit-making mechanism, and so their ability to, this is another suggestion, that their ability to absorb these costs might be better than a public utility that's constrained to pure cost recovery outcomes. But some of the issues with this, investor-owned utilities charge water rates that are higher than publicly owned utilities, and a Food and Water Watch piece has estimated that to be about 59% higher. If you talk about sewer rates for investor-owned, which would be private entities, Food and Water Watch has estimated that those rates are about 63% higher than publicly owned utilities. And so if we look at trends, how privatization is impacting residential rates. So this Food and Water Watch study found that the 10 largest sales of municipal water and sewer systems in the United States to for-profit entities between the 1990 and 2010 period, those residents found that average water rates increased by about 18% every other year. Studies have also noted that there's no notable difference in efficiency. That's another rationale for private entities could perhaps more efficiently provide water to end users than public entities, but that's not necessarily the case. There's a great book out called The Price of Thirst, and they kind of profile Suez and Viola water companies, and they do account for a majority of privatization contracts globally. So that's a great book to read. The Price of Thirst. Mazdak Arabi originally recommended that to me. It is a very interesting read and a good lens on international water issues. So when we say privatization, they're different, and I'll just move through this quickly so we can get to the study and not take up too much time here on the webinar. But in terms of privatization contracts, or when we say privatization, it can mean several different things. And so here's just a quick simplified overview of what that could mean. So it could be a management contract in which assets are publicly owned, but the private entity is responsible for running the system in exchange for some sort of fee. and then the investment is financed and carried out by the public sector. So the only role of the private entity is to run the system. Privatization can take the form of a lease contract, in which case publicly owned assets are leased to a private company, and then the private company receives a share of the revenues. This is a little bit more risky for the private entity, but still the investment is fully or almost entirely financed by the public sector. The third potential option is mixed ownership, in which case the private investor actually takes a small share in the publicly owned water entity, and then the private entity is also granted a management contract to oversee operations. And then finally, a concession. This is where the private entity has the largest role, and in this case, the private company is responsible for operating the entire system, and the investment is almost entirely fully financed by the private entity. So if we think about we've now talked about water rates are going up, why they're going up, some different strategies for thinking about how we might run and manage water systems and what types of entities should be in charge of that. And so now I want to move to talk about what this means from a local perspective. And again, when I said local, I'm thinking about what this means for households. And so if we think about this, well, there's been a lot of international work done on this particular subject. And studies estimate that about 60% of the population of low-income countries find it very difficult to afford water priced at full cost recovery rates. And I will tell you a little bit more about full cost recovery in just a bullet point or so. As I said, though, a lot of the work on affordability emphasizes a utility perspective or looks at affordability issues for households in the developing world. But there's very little work that's been done in the developed world. There's been some good work done by researchers in the UK. But in the United States, studies are limited to case-specific work, and they haven't sort of looked at this from a broader perspective. So I want to talk a little about cost recovery. Because that's one of the reasons that people believe water costs will go up. So water is currently underpriced, and Jan Beecher talks about a range of reasons why this is so. A lack of information about the cost of running the system, so they underestimate the cost of running the system. Deferrals of investment, we just talked about before, we haven't upgraded infrastructure for quite some time, and we're sort of reaching the point where that needs to happen. Or infrastructure is subsidized, and in many countries this is the case where water utilities receive some sort of subsidy, which reduces their cost of operations. And so in many cases, the full cost of providing water services or full cost recovery is not yet in effect. And so there is some concern that, what does this mean for consumers if that does go into effect? And the other piece here that I'm not going to talk about is pricing water for scarcity. So that's been the case using a pricing mechanism to ration water in California in some of their drought situations. But in most places, water is not priced as a scarce economic resource. So when we say full cost recovery, we're just thinking of what it means for the utilities to provide services to end users. All right, so some work, just some information more about water affordability in the U.S. context. So I mentioned that this has been an issue in Detroit historically. So there were a lot of shutoffs that took place in Detroit, and since 2014, 50,000 households had termination of service for delinquent payments on bills. There are a variety of reasons why this happened. Jan's been very engaged locally, Jan Beecher, in both Detroit and Flint, and she said that the mechanism or the way that the bills are being sent out, they're being sent to addresses and not necessarily people. So that's one of the reasons why people weren't getting or paying their water bills, because they weren't getting them. But there were other very serious incidents where residents could not afford the cost of service. It's also an issue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Studies have estimated that about 4 out of 10 water accounts are past due. And in terms of thinking about who pays the most for water. Walton from Circle of Blue looks at combined water costs of water, sewer, and in some cases stormwater. So Atlanta and Seattle have the highest costs in the United States. In Atlanta, people pay about $325.52 a month for water, and in Seattle, that monthly cost is about $309.72, and so if you annualize that in Atlanta, that annualizes to about $3,906. In Seattle, just about $3,700. So what we wanted to do, given this prior work on affordability, which really looks at this from an international perspective, so there's been a lot of work done. I mentioned some work on the UK, but a lot in Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa context. There have been some case studies in the United States, but I think it would be interesting to look at this more. I thought it would be interesting to look at this from a U.S. context. But one of the tricky pieces, and I want to place sort of a star by this water consumption piece, is that we know that water consumption varies a lot within and between countries, and I sort of highlighted that at the beginning of the webinar. And so that'll be a caveat to the results of the study that I present, and so just keep this in mind, and we'll bring it up as a point for discussion towards the end of this webinar. All right, so the present study, I'm going to shift now to talking about the results of that study that came out on +1 in January. And what we try to do in this study is look at three basic questions. To what extent might current water rates be affordable for American households right now? To what extent might future water rates be affordable for American households? And then what are spatial patterns in the ability to pay, or this affordability piece, for water services? So what we did is we got information from the AWWA, which is the American Water Works Association, and they have a biennial survey of water and wastewater rates. And we got that information from their 2015 survey, and it provides information from about 318 utilities in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. And what we did, part of the information that they have in this survey is they have the percent of monthly household income, which is what MHI stands for on this slide. And they'll say, for this particular utility, a water bill is X% of monthly household income, and then they'll also report the median household income. Then they'll also report the median household income for that particular water provider. And so based on this information, we were actually able to back out the annual water bill for each utility report, for which the AWWA collected information. What we then did is we say, based on this annual water bill, we wanted to calculate the per unit cost of water. So they had three different consumption levels for which they reported information. Those were 3,740 gallons a month, 7,480 gallons per month, and then 11,220 gallons per month. And so what we then did is calculated the per unit cost of water for each of those consumption levels, and I have the formula there from the paper on this slide. And what that, and so we wanted to do it by these varying consumption levels in case there was some sort of economies of scale to using more water at higher consumption levels, and we found that there was not. And so the unit cost for 1 gallon of combined water and wastewater or sewer services is 1 cent. And I do want to highlight this is a combined figure for water and sewer services. We're not just looking at water, but both water and sewer. The next thing we did is we said, all right, well, we want to calculate what an annual water bill would be. So we took this per gallon cost of water, which is 1 cent, times 12,000 gallons of use, and this usage level, which it corresponds to about 100 gallons per person per day, and so 12,000 gallons is 100 gallons of water per person per day for a household of 4. Why did we choose this level? We debated using a variety of usage levels in this paper. And when you see the results, you can see how this the complexity of the results scales quite quickly. The EPA has cited this as sort of typical use, and the study that was done by Circle of Blue about water rates also uses 12,000 gallon piece. And so we thought if people wanted to look at our study and compare it to what else is going, some other information that's out there, our study would provide comparable information. And so that was the rationale for choosing 12,000 gallons, but certainly we can discuss that piece there. So the 2015 AWWA survey, which is co-collected with Raftellus, if people are more familiar with Raftellus, it has information on 2014 water rates. And then what we did is, based on that Circle of Blue work, which looked at a 6% rate increase in water and a 41% rate increase, we said for 12,000 gallons of water a month, here's your monthly water bill. So based on our calculations of that per gallon cost from AWWA. That monthly water bill is about $120. That annualized to $1,440. And so then we said, what is the minimal annual income that a household would need to make to afford that particular water bill? And EPA has some affordability criteria, and for combined water and sewer services, they say that a water bill should not exceed 4.5% of household income. And so in order for a water bill to not comprise more than 4.5% of household income, that income threshold was $32,000 per year. So then what we did is we collected Census Tract information from the Census Bureau, and they report household income information, and we were able to tabulate the number of households in the United States that make less than $32,000 per year, and that's about 11.9% of all U.S. households. Then we said, all right, well, let's take a look at, if rates go up by 6% and 41%, what's the annual water bill, and then what income levels are necessary to make for that water bill to be affordable. So we came up with, for a 6% increase, $33,920, and for a 41% rate increase, $45,120. And so you can see with a 41% rate increase, you wind up with about 35.6% of households that make less than $45,120 per year. So that's just based on household income. Studies have also suggested it's important to look at compounding issues that could impact affordability, in the sense that these are signals that a household is in income distress, or their future prospects for earning additional income are reduced for one reason or another. So we looked at disability status of people in census tracts, variations in median household income by race and ethnicity, how much are people paying in gross rent as a percentage of household income, unemployment status, lack of health insurance, receipt of public assistance income, educational attainment, the presence of sole female-headed households with no partner present, and then also food stamp and SNAP recipients. So we packaged this together, and our question was, aside from this, are there statistical differences if we look at these characteristics between households that are making under $32,000 a year, which is our affordability income threshold, and above $32,000 a year. And so what we did is we did an ANOVA analysis, and this is the full suite of information associated with that. And what we found was, yes, for all of these different dimensions of compounding issues of affordability, there are differences. And so I'm just going to use my cursor here. If you look at percent of people that are disabled in tracts where median income is under $32,000 a year, 17.3% of people are disabled, compared to 12.1% of folks that are disabled in households that make greater than or equal to $32,000 annually. I won't belabor this, but I'll say another really salient difference, unemployment levels. So in tracts that make under $32,000 a year, unemployment levels were approximately double that of compared to tracts where income was over $32,000 a year. So this signals that not only is this income piece important to consider, but these tracts also have people with compounding problems that could impact their future income earning potential. So what does this look like spatially? I'm a geographer, so I have to map things. And so here's a map of these at-risk and high-risk tracts. And so the high-risk tracts, I said this study is best viewed from a vulnerability perspective, given the variation of water rates nationally and also usage levels. But we just want to say, where might people be experiencing these affordability challenges? So the black tracts represent high-risk places, and these are tracts where people make under $32,000 a year, and they could be having trouble paying their current water bill. The dark gray tracts are your at-risk tracts, and so if water rates go up by 6 or 41%, these are tracts where people's income is insufficient to afford future increases in water rates at these projected 6 and 41% rates. And so that gives you a sense of the geography. And generally what we pick up here, since this is income driven, is that lower income areas of the country are having problems. So the southeastern United States, which tends to have a lower income levels than the rest of the country, which is why I don't see so much moving out west where incomes are higher. This does largely reflect the geography of income. However, I think within urban areas, there are some interesting questions to think about moving forward based on the results. And I've highlighted some interurban patterns here for Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Phoenix. And these were selected because they are points of interest in the news, Atlanta and Detroit certainly, and Philadelphia, but also because many of these, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 6 inset maps here are also U-wind study regions. So you can see sort of these pockets of water poverty here within these metropolitan areas. And this is really important to think about, if a utility has a consumer base, a collection or a large percentage of its consumer base that might not be able to pay their bills, this could be a problem for utilities. They want to price their bills they want to price water so that to recover costs, but it's also beneficial to everybody that consumers pay their bills. So if consumers cannot pay their bill, this is not only a problem for households, but you can also think about what this might mean for the utilities that service these households in high-risk and at-risk tracts. So just a little bit more about the geography of this. I think I didn't skip a slide. That's great. So we want to look at, the states that have the highest concentrations of these two categories of tracts. So if we look at high-risk tracts here, Mississippi ranked number 1. So out of 241 tracts, 36.5% of those tracts had households that were at potentially high risk for not being able to pay their water bill. Michigan comes in here, about 21% of tracts could be flagged as high risk. So if you look at what this might mean for affordability from a future looking context, at-risk tracts, West Virginia actually ranked highest in terms of number of tracts, or percentage of tracts, I should say, that were classified as high risk. And there are we did do some cross-checking of these results with information out there about places that are experiencing water challenges. And we have heard from folks actually in West Virginia to say, we're in trouble out here in terms of affording water. And so that kind of jives with this ranking of number 1, West Virginia, for future problems of affording water. Florida ranked number 16, and then Mississippi, which is number 1 for the high-risk tracts, comes in at number 5 here if we think about this from a future context. So I'll begin to wrap things up now. If we think about the key findings of this, one of the questions we got and that we added in the paper actually was, to what extent is this an urban phenomenon? Because there's certainly challenges with respect to water quality and affordability in rural areas. And what we found is that 81% of high-risk tracts and 63% of at-risk tracts are in census-defined urbanized areas. So this is fundamentally an urban problem. I mentioned, these pockets of water poverty. So if you zoom in into these metropolitan areas, you see these pockets of low-income neighborhoods in downtown Detroit, Phoenix, Philadelphia, just to name a few. And as I said before, this is important to investigate further because these could signal issues for specific utilities servicing these customer bases. And finally, another key finding, as I mentioned from that ANOVA assessment, are there statistical differences between these households that make under $32,000 and over $32,000 a year? The answer is yes. They face high rates of unemployment, issues with appropriate health insurance, and also reliance on food stamps and public assistance. So you can think of all these as additional pressures on this income piece for households. So I do want to highlight some assumptions here. We look at one level of water use, and as I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, there's so much variation in water rates that, saying every household, uses 12,000 gallons a month is not tenable. That's why I said this study is best viewed as a vulnerability assessment of water affordability. And we're also assuming that demand for water is price inelastic. So people's usage of water is not going to change with changing water prices. You might expect them to use less water as water prices go up, but that's not something that is considered in this particular study. And so I think that one of the things that this study raises is, we need to think more about how to price water to make bills affordable for all residents. And so I mentioned that Jones and Moulton study has some really interesting ideas about how to do that. So some people are thinking about income-based billing, how to restructure water rates. Is there some sort of minimally necessary level of water use that we should make affordable for all households, and then make water more expensive after that baseline level of usage. And but I think it is important, given what's going on with infrastructure and this vulnerability assessment about water and people's ability to pay for it, does give us a moment for pause about how to price water to make it more affordable for people. And certainly this is important too. I said, thinking regionally about this, you might say, well, some households are affected. How does this matter from a larger, big picture perspective? And I think it does matter from a big picture perspective. Inability to pay for water bills leads to indebtedness of households to utilities. In Michigan, people can lose their kids if you can't pay your water bill because it's deemed unfit. Your household is deemed unfit for children. People can lose their homes if they don't pay their water bills, and so this has for households cascading impacts. But you can also think about this from in terms of how households are linked to other sectors in the economy. So if water bills go up, households might have to say, I need to reduce spending in other income areas to absorb this increased cost of water. And but what income or what expenditure items might they reduce their spending on? And this is something that we don't have a lot of resolution on when it comes specifically to water. And so what we're doing, and I encourage you to tune in for the next webinar where we'll talk about input-output modeling approaches for evaluating these, what I'm going to call ripple effects of affordability. We're starting to look at information about household responses to recessions and also rising gas prices. Where might they stop spending money in order to afford rising water rates? And so based on our overview of studies that have looked at household spending patterns in times of recession and in response to rising gas prices, they might stop spending money on motor vehicle parts and motor vehicles themselves, furniture and home furnishing, clothing, going out to eat, and other types of entertainment. And so what we're now trying to do with survey-based input-output models is to link these spending areas up with our input-output tables to see what this might mean for regional output, jobs, and also regional income, because households are linked to other sectors of the economy. So stay tuned for that. And I also want to highlight many months down the road, Sharon Harlan will give a webinar where we're talking about social equity. But we are, aside from just using IO-based data on some of these scenario assessments of these ripple effects, we are going to be conducting a household survey to understand, using information from households themselves, how they might change their spending in response to rising water prices. So with that, I think I'm out of time, and I just want to say thank you to NSF and also the One Water Institute for supporting this work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. We have a couple questions that I think we have time to answer. So the first one is from Ellie. He's wondering if the prices that you showed are in constant dollars.
They are deflated to 2014 dollars. Yes. So we assume no inflation in household income, but we actually look back at trends in real household income for the last 20 years, and it's pretty flat.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answers his questions. The next question, are water prices higher in areas where vulnerability to water shortage is higher? For example, Phoenix versus Seattle.
No. So Phoenix actually has very, I would point folks to that Circle of Blue map. Phoenix water price is actually fairly cheap compared to Atlanta, Seattle. I don't know why, and so that's something that we're going to start looking into, why it's so cheap when you might think, people are in a desert. But no, they're not necessarily linked.
Great, thank you. The next question is about water in the West. Is the cost of trans-basin water transfers accounted for in water in the Western United States? So does the water bill reflect the cost of a transbasin water transfer?
I would think that, moving all that water would be factored into the cost of providing service to end users. That would be interesting, though, to survey utilities and ask that specifically.
Okay, so I have a couple more. Oh, go on.
I said I would hope that would appear in their cost of cost of service, but that'd be good to just verify.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Were water bill data obtained from individual utilities across the U.S.? And if so, could the study be conducted at the census block group level?
We did not get individual. So AWA, I have trouble saying that, surveys particular utilities, and so we use the information from that survey of utilities. We're in the process now of going utility by utility for UN regions, and some of those were highlighted in the map there towards the end, the inset maps. We are in the process of collecting utility-specific water pricing information. But for this present study, we did not do that. It was the AWWA survey that we used.
All right. Does source water, for example, surface water versus groundwater, influence the cost or the bill and affordability issues?
The question is, does it?
Correct. Does the source of the water influence the cost or affordability issues?
I could certainly see that it would in terms of extraction costs or, the energy required to source water from aquifers as opposed to surface water. But that's not something that we looked at specifically in our study.
Okay. Do you think this problem can be solved by water pricing control, or is it an economic justice issue since some households just make very low income?
I think it's a dual-sided issue, so we have to think about this from both sides. How can we price water better? And that's why I talked a little bit about at the end. There's been some conversations, so Jan and I have been kicking this can around of, what can we do? It is an income issue for sure. We can't just subsidize everyone and say, here's more money for everyone. But, is there some baseline level of use that we could make affordable for folks? That might be a good starting point. And then the other side of this, obviously, is what can we do to help people better educate themselves and get better paying jobs? That's a little bit beyond the scope of the UN research, but I think it is important to highlight that it's a double-sided issue. It's not just the water side.
Great. Did the AWWA survey give an indication of current consumption rates so you could look at current water bills, for example, taking into account widely varying water use and how those vary across cities?
They report information for three consumption tiers. I'm sorry, it's 4 consumption tiers. So 3,740 gallons a month, 7,480 gallons per month, 11,220 gallons a month, and then 22,400 gallons per month. So we were debating, we chose this 12,000 gallons of use for comparability purposes, and we were also going to do these varying levels of usage in the paper. And it got, when we started, we actually did 3 ANOVA analyses, so I just showed you the one for the baseline assessment of affordability. And so as we added additional usage levels, this magnified the ANOVA analyses, and it became very sort of unwieldy to synthesize for this paper. And so what we're doing now, and we're collecting information about water prices from individual utilities, and we are going to write more focus pieces that hone in on a particular area, and this will provide us latitude to look at varying levels of water use, which is important to examine from this affordability standpoint. And so that's how we're going to address that in studies moving forward.
Okay. How did you separate the sewer portion of the bill from the total water bill?
We did not. So it's a combined water and sewer bill.
Okay, great, thank you. To circle back to our very first question about the pricing and if those were constant, Ellie just wanted to clarify that he was asking about the prices at the very beginning, showing, for example, the increase in Austin. So were those prices listed in constant dollars?
Yeah, they're current dollars.
Okay, and then we just have two additional comments here. The first from Sharon saying another low-income affordability strategy could be water subsidies to low-income households, like food subsidies. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Liz.
That's certainly one option. The other thing that we're thinking about is subsidies to the utilities themselves, which would reduce the pressure, the cost pressure that they're facing, and then would indirectly benefit consumers. But some sort of subsidy could be an answer, yes, absolutely.
Okay, and then one additional comment here from Nasdaq. The UNC Environmental Finance Center has collected water bill data for water utilities in 14 states. The data include information on affordability and cost recovery. It would be nice to compare results with the utility data for the ENC EFC dashboards. So just a little food for thought moving forward.
Yeah, that would save us some effort too. So UNC water prices from 14 utilities. All right, I'll touch base with him just to make sure I'm tracking the right source there. I have seen that they have an affordability assessment tool, which is kind of fun, but I didn't see those data, so I'll check in with him.
Okay, great. Well, we haven't had any more questions pop up in the last couple minutes, so thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, everybody, to join us this afternoon. Thank you to Liz for giving that fascinating presentation. We will be distributing a link to the video, which will be posted on both the UN website as well as our YouTube channel as soon as it's available. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a wonderful day, guys.